Big changes are happening with the OLED monitor market with the arrival of new 4th gen WOLED panels from LG Display. This is one of the most eagerly anticipated OLED monitors this year. It's the Gigabyte MO27Q28G, which was announced first at Computex 2025 in May and is using one of these new 4th gen panels, which promises a range of improvements to brightness, contrast and colours, all at a very attractive price point too, especially when you consider that this is a brand new screen and new technology upgrade. The MO27Q28G is one of the first screens to be released featuring one of these new so-called primary RGB tandem panels. It's 27 inches in size with a 1440p resolution and a 280Hz refresh rate. Those are fairly typical specs, modest you might even say, but the real interest is in what these new 4th gen panels can offer. HDR brightness has been improved, including offering a peak brightness spec of 1500 nits, and SDR luminance specs have also been improved 22% from 275 to 335 nits. Color gamut has been extended considerably, and black depth and ambient light handling has also been enhanced to improve contrast in brighter room conditions. If you want to know loads more about 4th gen WOLED panels, primary RGB tandem and all that kind of stuff, and what makes all of this possible, do check out our full video or written article that are linked below for loads more info. Let's get into all of our testing then to see how this new screen performs. Let's start by looking at SDR brightness, an area which has been significantly improved thanks to this new 4th gen panel. We switched out of the default eco mode, which is designed for power saving, and into the custom mode for testing this. The screen operates with a uniform brightness behaviour by default, with the orange line on this graph representing that mode running at the maximum brightness setting. It can reach up to an impressive 333 nits, which is a decent step up from previous gen OLED panels, which typically reach around 270 nits maximum from our testing. That's one of the benefits of this new 4th gen WOLED panel and represents a 23% increase in luminance, reaching basically to the advertised 335 nits spec too. There is a setting in the OLED care menu called APL Stabilize, which is set to low by default, and that gives you this uniform brightness behaviour, but which you can also change if you want to the middle and the high modes. The middle mode gives you a modest boost in brightness in SDR applications, and it can reach up to 555 nits now, but you will see some moderate ABL dimming and fluctuations in screen brightness as the content changes. The high mode pushes things to a far more extreme level, actually opening up the full brightness capability of the panel, even in SDR mode, and it now reaches up to a very impressive 1504 nits at the smallest APL. Then dimming kicks in, and it's fairly aggressive in this mode of course as the scenes get brighter and the APL increases. These two modes could be useful for SDR gaming and multimedia if you want a brighter experience in those scenes, although you'll have to live with some ABL dimming, so we wouldn't recommend them during desktop applications and office uses really. The middle mode is probably a useful middle ground to give you a modest boost in SDR brightness without causing too much ABL dimming. The MO27Q28G features a standard matte anti-glare coating, which does a very good job of handling glare and reflections. Visually, the coating looked the same as previous gen WOLED panels with their matte coating finish, with the same minor visual grain to the image. One significant improvement though for the new 4th gen WOLED panel is with their black depth, a feature which LG Display referred to as visual superiority, and which UL Solutions, an independent body, have also certified as perfect black. That's perfect black even in brighter room environments too. Basically, these panels retain their amazing black depth better than previous gen WOLED panels, even in brighter room conditions, which helps maintain their contrast and the deep blacks that you'd associate with OLED technology. We measured the black depth of the screen in a range of ambient light conditions and compared that to the other WOLED panel and coating combinations. The green line here represents this Gigabyte screen, and you can see that the black depth is excellent even in brighter room conditions, and a significant improvement over the dark blue line which represents earlier gen WOLED panels with a matte coating. Those panels just aren't as black as these new 4th gen panels, although they were still significantly better than QD-OLED panels in this area, we should point out. The matte coating combination on this Gigabyte model gives very close results to the true black coating used on the competing ASUS XG27AQ WMG. That's represented by the yellow line on the graph, which has the same 4th gen panel, but a glossy screen coating finish. The glossy coating does help the screen hang on to its black depth slightly better in brighter rooms, as the coating doesn't diffuse the light in the same way that the matte coating does, but it's actually closer than we expected it to be. The 4th gen panel seems to do a really good job of producing blacks in all lighting conditions, and compared to a QD-OLED panel, there's no contest really in this area. Coating is a personal preference and it will depend on your individual lighting conditions. The matte coating of the Gigabyte model doesn't look as clear and sharp as the glossy coating on the ASUS alternative, but it handles reflections and glare a lot better, which is useful if you've got windows or lights facing the screen, or if you're using the screen a lot more during the daytime or in well-lit rooms. Regardless of your preference, these tests show that there's not a big difference in black depth retention between the two at least. Let's look at SDR accuracy and performance too. By default, the screen is set in the Eco preset mode with the full native wide gamut of the panel active. In this mode, we found gamma to be a bit too high, especially in dark grey shades, which leads to a little loss of shadow detail, but it's still good even so. Color temp and white point was slightly too cool, but didn't cause any real problems for the grayscale accuracy. There's a very wide native gamut for this new panel, reaching 153% relative coverage of sRGB, which leads to the normal poor accuracy for SDR and sRGB colours in this mode. That's normal though for a wide gamut screen, and we'll explore ways to more accurately work with sRGB content in a moment. The colour space extends a considerable way beyond the DCI-P3 reference as well, and gives you the highest overall colour gamut coverage we've seen from a WOLED panel to date, at around 85% Rec 2020 coverage. The colour accuracy of DCI-P3 colours is better, given the closer match of the native colour space, rated as good here with a delta E 1.9 average. Although there's still large errors in blue shades, especially due to the overcoverage. If we compare the colour gamut with a 3rd gen WOLED panel and a typical QD-OLED panel, you can see the significant improvements in the range of colours here with the new 4th gen WOLED panel for SDR. It's gone from 127% coverage to 153% relative coverage of sRGB, and from 74% relative coverage of Rec 2020 to 89%, with large improvements in red and blue shade coverage especially. Gigabyte provide 3 emulation modes in the menu to work more accurately with different target colour spaces. The sRGB mode is available via a dedicated preset mode, which has nearly all of the settings locked down other than for brightness control. At least we can adjust that, unlike some other screens where this is entirely locked down. The gamma is configured to an sRGB gamma curve here, but it's a bit higher than it intended, which causes some loss of detail in lighter grey shades especially. The colour temp and RGB balance is very good though, with only a minor 2% deviance from our target 6500 Kelvin, resulting in a largely accurate grayscale. In this sRGB mode, shadow detail is improved a little more with very good detail, and the first visible grayscale shade is now RGB1. This mode provides reasonable clamping of the wide native colour space back to sRGB as well, although it's not perfect in blue shades and leaves some overcoverage, around 9% in total. The accuracy of sRGB colours is much better though now in this mode, with delta E 1.5 average measured. It's a pretty decent mode for sRGB and SDR content, and certainly avoids the large overcoverage that you see in the native mode. We'd have just liked a slightly tighter colour space clamping and full access to on-screen controls really. It's a little odd that the sRGB mode is activated in a completely different way to the DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB emulation modes, having its own defined preset mode, whereas the others are actually accessible when using the other preset modes like the custom mode for example, with a specific colour space setting allowing you to switch between native, DCI-P3 or Adobe RGB gamuts. They're all still locked down in all of their settings other than the brightness control, and really we'd have liked to see more user control in all of these emulation modes to be honest. DCI-P3 mode provides decent overall accuracy for gamma, colour temp and grayscale, along with very good shadow detail, and again a reasonable emulation of the target colour space. That's commonly used for HDR content. Like the sRGB mode, it's not perfect in blue shades, but DCI-P3 colour accuracy is good. The Adobe RGB mode has a very similar colour temp and grayscale, but its gamma is too high in dark shades, which leads to some black crush. This mode isn't quite as good as the other emulation modes for shadow detail, but it's still very good, and the colour space clamping is more accurate here though, with only a small 3% over coverage measured. Although the absolute coverage of the colour space is around 96%, so slightly undercovered due to the limitations with the panel's native colour space. It can't quite cover the full Adobe RGB area. Colour accuracy was good again, and so this mode could be useful if you need to work specifically with Adobe RGB content that's commonly used in the photography sector. You can use any of these 3 modes that you like really for general content, depending on which colour space you want to work with. You may also want to try out our calibrated settings and ICC profile, which were created in the custom native gamut mode with the ICC profile, map back to the sRGB reference space for use in color-aware applications. You'll find our best settings video guide for this screen and a link to our calibrated ICC profile in the description below. Here's a recap of the brightness capabilities and shadow detail performance of each of the modes before we wrap up, which includes the luminance adjustment range in each, the shadow detail rating, and some recommended settings for the brightness control in the bottom right hand corner. The 27-inch screen size and 1440p resolution is very common nowadays and makes the screen comfortable for office and general applications, without needing to use any operating system scaling. Another good thing about this new panel is that it's only the second 27-inch WOLED panel to switch to LG Display's improved sub-pixel layout, which helps improve text clarity and text rendering quite well. The only other 27-inch WOLED panel to feature this new layout so far was their 480Hz option from their previous gen lineup, so it's great to see that this is also making its way to their new 4th gen WOLED panels too. The matte anti-glare coating is well suited to brighter daytime usage and office environments, helping to reduce reflections nicely. There's still some minor graininess to the anti-glare coating, so it doesn't look as sharp and clear as a glossy coating option. And while coating is very subjective, we think this is probably more appropriate for most of these kind of office uses. As ever, you need to be mindful of using any OLED screen for extended periods of static work due to the inherent risks of image retention and burn-in. These screens are more suited to dynamic content like gaming and multimedia, although Gigabyte do provide an extensive range of OLED care features in this screen. That includes a fanless design with a custom heatsink for cooling, many familiar OLED care settings in the menu, and it's all backed by a 3-year warranty which includes burn-in cover for peace of mind. The spectral distribution is shown here for D65 white point, and there's no specific low blue light modes on this screen, but you could maybe use the warm color temp mode for lots of text work or using the screen in the evening. You can see the improved separation of the green and red spectrums on this new 4th gen WOLED panel compared with an older 3rd gen panel. That's thanks to that separation of the red and the green light emitting layers in the new panel structure. We also verified that the screen is flicker free as advertised. The monitor has a thin metal arm to support the panel, as well as a new 2mm thin metal foot, which is small in size to maximise your desktop area and space. It's a modest and non-gamery design which looks clean and simple, and there's also a full range of adjustments from the stand, all of which are pretty smooth and easy to move. Height adjustment is a little stiff, but the screen remains very stable during movement with very little wobble, which is great. There's also a wide range of modern office conveniences, including USB Type-C connectivity, there's a KVM switch function, picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture modes, and USB ports as well. Gigabyte also includes some moderate dual-integrated 5-watt speakers, something not offered on many OLED monitors, which may be useful for some users, or there's a headphone connection if you'd rather use that. The MO27Q28G is very well suited to HDR content, thanks to its OLED panel with per pixel level dimming, allowing for true blacks, a basically infinite contrast ratio, and the avoidance of blooming and halos that you might see on LCD panels with local dimming. As it uses a WOLED panel, it's free from the challenges around raised blacks in the presence of ambient lighting that impact QD-OLED panels, and in fact this panel does particularly well at retaining its black depth thanks to the new 4th gen WOLED panel, an improvement over older WOLED panel generations. It's been certified under the VESA Display HDR 500 True Black tier, a step up in brightness requirements compared with all of the HDR 400 True Black OLED monitors that we've seen in the past. With a spec that includes 1500 nits peak brightness, that's made possible again thanks to the new 4th gen panel and the primary RGB tandem panel structure. There's a wide range of modes and options available in HDR on the screen, with 5 different preset modes and loads of different settings that you can use to tweak things, including the brightness and contrast controls, then some specific options for light, colour and dark enhanced features. The main setting which also impacts brightness in HDR mode is the APL stabilize setting, which is available in the OLED care menu. Each of the HDR preset modes carries predefined settings for all of these as shown here, but you can adjust them in most of the modes. Each preset is basically just predefined setting combinations, so you can make 2 modes behave the same by manually tweaking the settings, not that there's really much point in doing that. You can see that the HDR default mode and movie mode are set with the APL stabilize setting on medium, whereas the game, vivid and peak 1500 modes have it set to high. A quick comparison of the peak white luminance performance shows the variation between the different modes. It's impacted primarily by that APL stabilize setting. You can see here that the screen reaches up to an impressive 1565 nits peak luminance, meeting the advertised spec nicely and offering some of the highest brightness capabilities to date from any OLED monitor. The modes which use the APL stabilized middle setting only reach around 554 nits peak. To test the accuracy of HDR, we first of all measured the EOTF tracking in the default HDR mode at a range of different APL, from low APL that represent darker scenes up to high APL percentage that represent lighter scenes. As a reminder, this default HDR mode has APL stabilized set on middle, and so the peak brightness is capped to around 540-550 nits. The EOTF tracking is nice and accurate at smaller APL and then starts to show some slight roll off for higher APL as you get to around 50% and above. A small amount of roll off is useful for helping to preserve tonal values in situations where brightness is more restricted, although it's perhaps a little bit more than intended here, causing some light grey shades to be a little bit darker than intended. In darker shades, the luminance is a little low as well, slightly crushing darker details, but not too much. Overall though, the EOTF tracking was accurate in this mode. We also had a good colour temp and grayscale, only being a little bit too cool in lighter shades than white, but not anything significant or noticeable in practice. Shadow detail was good as well in this HDR mode, and the colour gamut remained basically the same as the native SDR mode, but we had very good colour accuracy for Rec 2020 HDR colours, with a Delta E 1.4 average measured. What about the full brightness modes then? Well, when we first tested the screen, we actually identified some problems with these modes, which we fed back to Gigabyte. For some reason, the colour saturation would drop a little bit when you move to the APL stabilized high modes, which caused noticeably less colourful image in real-world content. We also saw some poor EOTF tracking in those modes, which impacted mid and light grey shades, and that resulted in the APL high mode actually ending up looking darker visually in many scenes than the middle mode, despite their higher peak brightness capability. That was using the original firmware that the unit ships with, but Gigabyte then provided us an updated firmware for us to use in this review, which we're told will be released publicly on their website very soon after the planned launch. If you buy the screen, make sure you go and get the latest firmware from their website, as that will include all of these HDR fixes and bugs that we saw in the brighter HDR modes. Anyway, with the new firmware installed, we switched to the HDR game mode, for which the APL stabilized setting is on high. We know that this is capable of delivering a much higher peak luminance of around 1500 nits, 3 times the luminance nearly of the APL middle mode and the default HDR preset. EOTF tracking was less accurate in this mode, although the main difference was for the darker, lower APL scenes, where there was some over-brightening of mid to light grey shades. That causes some bright areas of the screen to lose a little bit of detail, but by the time the APL reaches around 25%, this over-brightening was very slight, and then for brighter, higher APL scenes, it reverted to some minor roll-off instead, like we'd seen in the default HDR mode and the middle APL stabilized setting. Grayscale colour temp and white point remain basically the same as the middle APL HDR mode, so the main change here is the EOTF tracking and the brightness that the screen can then also reach. Colour accuracy remained very good in this HDR game mode too, which was great news, although we noted a minor reduction in the colour space, with the mode cutting out the slight overcoverage of the Rec 2020 colour space that you see in the APL middle configuration. It was minor and it didn't look visually really any different in real world content anyway. We can also compare the average grayscale brightness in each of the 2 APL stabilized modes to more thoroughly consider real-world brightness. This shows that both modes offer the same overall scene brightness for most situations, except in the darker, lower APL scenes, where the high mode can then reach up to much brighter overall. That's supported by real-world subjective testing, which confirms in practice the APL high mode looks just as bright as the middle mode in higher APL scenes, and then reaches noticeably brighter in the darker scenes. The extra peak luminance in that configuration helps highlights pop more and darker scenes have a more impactful HDR experience. We also compared the screens side by side with the ASUS ROG Strix XG27AQ WMG, which uses the same 4th Gen WOLED panel, just with a glossy screen coating. The Gigabyte model was marginally brighter overall, and in side-by-side comparisons you could see some instances where it looked a little bit brighter, mostly in the darker scenes, the low APL scenes. Both models offer impressive HDR brightness though, thanks to the new 4th Gen WOLED panel. There's also a couple of other settings that are interesting for tweaking things. The dark enhance setting makes a very minor tweak to the darker grey brightness, which can help make some of those dark grey shades slightly easier to see. It's very minor, but we prefer that to be turned on. The light enhance mode is way more drastic, and it causes noticeable overbrightening of the image and the EOTF curve, leading to actually quite a lot of lost detail overall. This gets progressively more severe, raising dark shades as well as light shades as you increase the setting. Here's a visual representation of the results showing a grayscale bar for each of the 4 modes. Along the top of each bar are the grey shades measured, and at the bottom of each bar shows the target shade. You can see here that even in the off mode, some grey shades end up being a bit brighter than intended, and the detail ends up getting crushed a bit. When using the light enhance mode, even more of the grey shades are brighter than they should be, which crushes even more detail. This starts to also impact darker shades and darker detail in the highest modes. You can experiment with this perhaps if you want a brighter HDR experience at the cost of accuracy, but we expect level 1 would be the limit of how far you'd want to push this, to be honest, and even then it causes far too much lost detail for our liking. The colour enhance mode makes some minor adjustments to the vividness of colours, making them a little less accurate, but some people might like the slightly increased saturation and colourfulness. It's nice to have all of these settings available to play with anyway. This new Gigabyte monitor is well suited to gaming with near instant response times, a high refresh rate up to 280Hz, and the amazing picture quality, colours, contrast and HDR support that an OLED panel can offer. Adaptive Sync is used to support variable refresh rates, and the screen is expected to include certification under the NVIDIA G-Sync compatible and AMD FreeSync Premium Pro schemes. All OLED monitors can show flicker and gamma fluctuations in VRR situations, and that's something that we studied and tested in detail in our recent article that's linked below. Gigabyte have included some new anti-flicker options on the screen to help give you some modes that will hopefully help reduce flicker should you experience any in your usage. Remember that just because a screen can show flicker doesn't mean that you'll necessarily experience it during your usage and for your system. There's modes for off, middle and high available. With the anti-flicker modes turned off, we saw an active VRR range of 48 to 240Hz, with LFC used below that. Like other WOLED technology panels we tested in our detailed study, the gamma response seems to be directly tied to the frame rate during VRR situations, and we saw the highest levels of flicker in darker content, which is also very common for OLED monitors. In lighter scenes, there was very little flicker at all. The middle and high anti-flicker modes serve to restrict the VRR range in an effort to try and prevent the gamma shifting too much. The middle mode doesn't really change things much in practice, and that's because the VRR range was still between 81 and 280Hz. The high mode did reduce visible flickering a reasonable amount, but that's primarily because the VRR range is restricted quite significantly now, including a dead zone between 141 and 166Hz, where neither VRR or LFC are used. Anyway, the trick with WOLED panels is to try and keep a consistent frame rate. It doesn't really matter so much if those are consistently high or consistently low, you just want them to be as stable as possible to reduce visible flicker and gamma fluctuations. If you experience any issues, you can experiment with these added modes, with the high mode providing the most visible benefit in practice. It's really nice to see Gigabyte start to include these modes on their new OLED monitors. Response times were, as you'd expect from an OLED screen, extremely impressive and near instant, with no visible overshoot too. With a 280Hz refresh rate, the motion clarity is excellent, being noticeably better in real-world content than the slower 144 and 165Hz refresh rate options, and offering very slight improvements compared with 240Hz. There's also some very slight improvements in frame rate support and overall system latency, so every little helps really when it comes to refresh rate. You can get even faster OLED screens nowadays, up to 500Hz are currently available, but 280Hz certainly can't be considered slow, and it'll likely suit most gamers perfectly well. There's a massive range of gaming extras and settings on the screen, something which Gigabyte really focus on through their so-called tactical features. There's actually a separate Game Assist menu which contains nearly all of these settings, with a couple then within the main menu instead. There's a black frame insertion mode for improving motion clarity, which we'll test in a moment, along with the anti-flicker modes that we talked about earlier. Those are new features, by the way, that Gigabyte are adding to their new OLED monitors moving forward, which is great to see. Their Tactical Switch 2.0 allows you to quickly switch between different aspect ratios and resolutions through the click of a single button. That may be handy to some people who want to easily play different games with different configurations. The black frame insertion mode is available via the ultra clear setting in the menu, which can only be enabled once you've disabled Adaptive Sync VRR. Like on the Asus monitors where we've seen this feature in the past, the operation of BFI is a bit cumbersome. You have to first disable VRR, then manually change your refresh rate to 120Hz in Windows, which is the only refresh rate supported for this feature, and then activate Ultra Clear. When you want to disable BFI later, you have to reverse these steps if you want to return to 280Hz operation and use VRR. It's available to use in SDR mode but not HDR, and offers a moderate maximum lumens of 167 nits. Not nearly as high as the 294 nits that we saw on ASUS's competing model, but still likely plenty for many users. The brightness control is adjustable, but annoyingly it's not remembered independently between the on and the off states, so you may have to change your brightness level as well when you want to use this feature. With Ultra Clear running at 120Hz, the screen basically operates at 240Hz, but every second frame is a black frame, which helps improve perceived motion clarity nicely. You get the same motion clarity actually with 120Hz and BFI as you do for a native 240Hz. And so this is a great way to shortcut your way to 240Hz like motion clarity if your system can only power lower frame rates up to 120Hz. Or alternatively, if your input device, like a games console for instance, only supports 120Hz maximum anyway. It could be a really useful feature for lower refresh rate systems and games, giving you a nice boost in motion clarity. Thanks to the amazing response times of the OLED panel, the image is clear across the whole panel too. You don't have to worry about strobe crosstalk and ghosting images like you do on equivalent LCD strobing backlights. Input lag was extremely low in the native 280Hz mode, which is also available and applicable in VRR gaming situations. It's a bit higher in a fixed 60Hz mode, but not bad compared with many screens. Remember, it's that lower 280Hz figure that applies when using VRR from the native refresh rate. In a new section suggested by our audience, we wanted to hone in on the shadow detail results a bit more, since this is an area that can impact darker game titles and is important to many gamers. The performance was good in the native custom mode and slightly better still in the emulation modes. Most gamers will probably want to stick with the full gamut custom mode for the most colourful image, and there's also a good way to then improve shadow detail further and make darker games easier to see in SDR. That's using the black stabilizer setting that's available in the menu, and it's got a slider that can be adjusted between levels of 0 and 20, with 10 being the default. Bumping this up a couple of notches improves shadow detail and darker grey shade brightness a fair bit, and it does a really good job actually of bringing out detail in darker scenes and darker games. Up to a setting of 12 seems to do this without causing any raised blacks, but if you go above that, the blacks start to turn a bit lighter. See what you prefer, but anywhere up to 12 seems to be a nice boost in these situations. In HDR, you don't have access to the black stabilizer setting, but shadow detail was overall good in that mode anyway, and the dark enhanced setting can be turned on, which makes things slightly better. Console gaming support was excellent, allowing for 4K 120Hz via virtual 4K support on the native 1440p panel. That's important especially for an Xbox, which only allows HDR content when using a 4K signal. There's some moderate integrated speakers as well, which might be handy to some people. VRR support's there, and also the ultra clear motion blur reduction mode can be used at 120Hz, which is really good for improving motion clarity. The MO27Q28G is an excellent monitor with a wide range of features, notable improvements in brightness, colours and black depth thanks to the new 4th gen panel, and some welcome new settings like BFI and anti-flicker to go along with Gigabyte's usual excellent range of gaming modes and extras. It's due to be released globally from the 30th of September, but on-shelf availability will vary by region depending on supply, shipping and so on. The global MSRP is an attractive and very competitive $549 US, although note that that is before things like tariffs are accounted for. We're also told that there'll likely be some offers around launch in some regions and for Black Friday and other holiday periods, so keep an eye on that in the coming months for an even better deal. We'll leave links in the description where you can check out the latest pricing and availability. If you want to know a lot more about 4th gen WOLED updates and improvements, you can check out our other video that's linked here. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do give us a quick like below. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.